Ancient lost world discovered off the US West Coast could rewrite the story of the first Americans. A remarkable archaeological story unfolding off the coast of California is challenging one of the longest standing theories about how the first humans arrived in the Americas. Now let's take a deeper look and uncover every layer of this story on our AI podcast.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today we're getting into something that honestly kind of broke my brain a little bit. We're looking at some excerpts and research notes from the Kelp Highway, Channel Islands, and America's first people.
Yeah, it's a fascinating set of sources. Really turns everything we thought we knew completely upside down.
Totally. And the mission for today, for you listening, is to explore this sort of, I guess you'd call it a prehistoric lost world, right? Hidden right off the coast of California, and is completely rewriting the story of how the very first humans arrived in the Americas.
Right, because, we all have that image in our heads, the one from the textbook.
Oh, yeah, the old history book map. The one with those big, confident red arrows starting up in Siberia, sweeping across Alaska, and pointing straight down through the middle of North America. It always looked like such a solved puzzle,
Exactly. It gave us this very comforting sense of certainty, like human beings walked from point A to point B, the ice melted, and boom, the Americas were populated. But the actual evidence we're uncovering now, it demands a major mental reset.
Which is wild. So to really understand this mystery, we have to kind of rewind, right? Set the scene during the last ice age.
Yeah, you have to picture a radically different North American coastline. I mean, colossal amounts of the Earth water were locked up in these massive, towering glaciers.
Meaning the sea levels were what, like way lower?
Oh, significantly lower, hundreds of feet lower than they are today. So that exposed these vast stretches of land that currently just sit at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean.
Have you ever considered that the history books you read in school about the first Americans might just be completely wrong? Because it's like a prehistoric detective story at this point, where the oldest clues are buried under the ocean.
That's a great way to put it. But to understand why these new Channel Islands discoveries are so revolutionary, we kind of first need to understand the traditional theory that they're dismantling.
Right, the old map. So we're talking about the clovis culture, right? That was the dominant theory for most of the 20th century.
Yeah, exactly. The clovis first model. And it was all based on these distinct fluted stone spear points that archaeologists kept finding. It dictated that the earliest Americans were these terrestrial, inland, big game hunters.
Right, chasing mammoths and stuff. And the established timeline was that they crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia over into Alaska, but then they were trapped there, right?
Yes, exactly. Continent-spanning glaciers physically blocked them from moving any further south. So the theory held that they basically just waited. They hung out up there until about 13,000 years ago.
Waiting for the ice to melt.
Right, waiting for the climate to warm just enough to open up this ice-free corridor through Western Canada, like a narrow pathway between these massive ice sheets.
So they wait for the door to open, and then they pour through, walking south. It's a very neat, tidy story. But, okay, this brings us to the anomaly, the massive wrench in the gears. Arlington Springs Man.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets really interesting.
So we're in 1959. Researchers are on Santa Rosa Island, which is miles off the coast of Southern California, and they find human bones buried 37 feet deep.
37 feet down in these ancient geological layers, yeah.
So the old theory is kind of like saying a train route was the only way into town, but we just found a passenger's time-stamped receipt at a station miles away, dated before the tracks were even built.
That is honestly a perfect analogy, because for a really long time, science just couldn't explain it.
Yeah.
When those bones were discovered in the late 50s, radiocarbon dating was still pretty much in its infancy.
Right, it wasn't as precise.
Not at all. The original dates were super murky. They suggested the bones were old, maybe around 10,000 years old, which, still fit comfortably after that Clovis migration timeline.
So they didn't really challenge the status quo yet.
No, because the problem with buried bone is that it acts like a sponge.
Right.
Over thousands of years, it absorbs groundwater, minerals, humic acids from the soil, and all of that contaminates the sample and skews the dating.
Oh, wow. So for decades, Arlington Springs Man was just like sitting in a museum drawer somewhere as this weird little footnote.
Pretty much, yeah. Until a massive turning point in 2001. That's when a radiocarbon specialist named Dr. Thomas Stafford decided to re-examine these remains.
Okay, so what did he do differently? Because the sources say this caused an absolute seismic shock to the timeline.
Well, Dr. Stafford used a much more advanced chemical purification process combined with this thing called accelerator mass spectrometry.
Okay, that sounds intense.
It is. Basically, instead of just testing the bulk bone material like they used to, his team was able to isolate specific amino acids from the bone's surviving collagen.
So they essentially stripped away all that 10,000 years of groundwater contamination.
Exactly. They stripped it all away to look at just the pure, organic signature of the actual human who died there. And that pristine sample, it returned a date of at least 13,000 years ago.
Wait, 13,000, which makes those bones among the oldest directly dated human remains ever found in North America.
Yes.
But okay, I have to push back here. Because if the inland ice corridor was supposedly just starting to open up 13,000 years ago, there is literally zero physical way a human being could have walked from Canada to Southern California and somehow ended up on an offshore island at the exact same time.
You've hit the nail on the head. The timeline completely shatters. And honestly, the geography presents an even bigger problem for that old theory.
Right, because Arlington Springs Man was found on an island.
Yes, and even with sea levels being significantly lower during the Ice Age, that specific landmass was never connected to the California mainland. There was always a deep, freezing ocean channel separating them.
So if they couldn't walk inland, and they somehow ended up on an island miles off the coast, they must have had, boats. Are you saying people in simple prehistoric canoes navigated the freezing Pacific Ocean during an ice age?
I am.
That sounds, almost suicidal. Without modern navigation or GPS, how is that even feasible?
And that exact skepticism is why the archaeological establishment resisted this idea for so long. It just sounded too impossible. But this leads us directly into the alternative migration theory, the one that answers your pushback.
The Kelp Highway hypothesis.
Exactly, the Kelp Highway hypothesis. Rather than looking at the harsh, frozen interior of the continent, this theory focuses entirely on the rich marine ecology of the Pacific Rim.
Right, so the idea is that early humans used simple watercraft to just follow the Pacific coastline from Northeast Asia up to Alaska and down into the Americas.
Yeah, they just navigated around the massive glaciers instead of waiting for the inland ice to melt.
The sources describe it as this nearly continuous marine ecosystem of kelp forests, stretching from Japan all the way to Baja California. But, is kelp alone enough to make a freezing open ocean voyage survivable?
It's not just the kelp itself, though seaweed is edible. It's the entire ecosystem. Think of it less like a terrestrial road and more like a prehistoric Silk Road of the sea.
Okay, I like that. So it's like a trans-Pacific road trip where the kelp forests acted like an endless chain of gas stations and all-you-can-eat buffets.
That is surprisingly accurate, yeah. The kelp forests provided abundant fish, shellfish, sea mammals, seabirds. But from a purely physical standpoint, giant kelp grows in these dense, towering underwater forests, right?
Right, they look like giant underwater trees.
Yeah, and they actually act as massive hydrodynamic breakwaters. They dampen the wave energy. So for an ancient mariner in a small boat, traveling just inside or alongside that kelp canopy means you are moving through significantly calmer water.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
So you're protected from the violent open ocean swell.
Exactly. Plus, the kelp beds provide an immediate anchor system if a storm suddenly rolls in.
That is brilliant. It physically alters the ocean to create a safe lane. And I remember Dr. John Johnson from the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History noting something really cool about this. He said this continuous Pacific Rim ecosystem made coastal travel highly realistic because they didn't have to constantly adapt.
Right. The continuity is the key. A mariner who knew how to harvest resources in Northeast Asia already possessed the exact specialized knowledge required to survive the journey down the American coast.
Because the species of fish and seals living in the kelp off Japan are incredibly similar to those off California.
Exactly. They didn't have to invent new hunting technologies every 100 miles. They bypassed the ice blockage on land by moving through a continuous, familiar, and highly productive environment.
It's just incredible to imagine, traversing the open ocean during the Ice Age in a simple boat, the sheer bravery of these ancient mariners. It really reframes how we picture early humans.
It absolutely does.
So, okay, if this coastal highway existed all along the Pacific Edge, why are we finding the best evidence specifically on California's Channel Islands?
Well, the Channel Islands are an incredibly rare geographical anomaly. They basically act as a prehistoric time capsule.
How so?
So during the Ice Age, when the sea levels were lower, the 4 northern islands we see today, San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, and Anacapa, they weren't separate islands. They were connected into one massive single landmass.
Oh, right, Santa Rosa.
Yes, Santa Rosa. And it wasn't just a barren rock. It had abundant freshwater, sprawling pine forests, and rich grasslands. But the real reason it's an archaeological gold mine today isn't just what was there. It's what didn't happen to it over the next 10,000 years.
You mean compared to the mainland?
Exactly.
Mm.
Across the California mainland, most 13,000-year-old campsites have been utterly destroyed. Thousands of years of shifting rivers, massive agricultural tilling, modern urban development. Paving a superhighway obliterates the delicate topsoil layers where ancient history lives.
Right, you can't exactly dig up a Walmart parking lot to look for clovis points.
Exactly. The Channel Islands experienced very little of that modern disturbance. But there is also a much larger global mechanism at play here when we ask why coastal evidence is so scarce worldwide.
The rising tides.
Yes. When the Ice Age ended, millions of cubic miles of glacial ice turned into water. The global sea level rose roughly 300 to 400 feet.
Which is just a staggering amount of water. So if sea levels rose hundreds of feet and wiped out the coastline, does that mean the vast majority of first American settlements are actually sitting at the bottom of the ocean?
Yes, that is the consensus among coastal archaeologists. The ocean basin is like a bathtub that slowly overflowed. The beaches and river mouths where these early maritime people camped simply do not exist above water anymore.
Man, that's wild. So the Channel Islands are just the rare peaks that survived the flood.
Exactly. They were the highest points of ancient coastal mountains.
Okay, we have to talk about the wildlife on Santa Rosa because it feels like straight-up science fiction. The sources mention that thousands of years ago, large Colombian mammoths actually crossed over to this island.
Yeah, and Colombian mammoths were huge. They stood up to 14 feet tall.
Wait, how did a 14-foot mammoth get to an island? Did they take boats too?
No boats for the mammoths. Elephants and their relatives are actually remarkably strong, distant swimmers. So when sea levels were at their lowest, the ocean channel separating the mainland from Santa Rosa was narrow enough that a herd could just swim across.
Probably smelling the fresh pine forests or something.
Most likely, yeah. Drawn by the vegetation.
But then the sea levels rose, the channel widened, and they were trapped. And over thousands of years, through isolation, they evolved into pygmy mammoths.
Yes.
I mean, it's like a prehistoric Honey, I Shrunk the Kids scenario. The notes say they were only about 6 feet tall. How does a massive Ice Age beast turn into a pony-sized elephant?
It's a biological process called insular dwarfism. The mechanism is driven entirely by island resources. A 14-foot mammoth requires hundreds of pounds of food every single day. On an island, an extended drought means massive animals will just starve.
Because there's nowhere else to go to find food.
Right, but any mammoth born with a genetic mutation making it slightly smaller requires fewer calories. And since the island lacked large predators like saber-toothed cats, there was no evolutionary advantage to being huge.
Oh, wow. So being small was actually a survival superpower.
Exactly. Over tens of thousands of years, natural selection aggressively favored the smaller animals.
So you have early humans arriving via this kelp highway, and they're sharing this island paradise with miniature mammoths. But the sources note that the pygmy mammoths vanished around the exact same time humans arrived. Did we just hunt them to extinction?
That is a very common assumption, but it's a fierce topic of debate. Currently, there is no definitive proof, no kill site, no pygmy mammoth skeleton found with a stone point embedded in its ribs, or surrounded by human butchery tools.
But the timing is awfully suspicious, right?
It correlates, yes, but correlation isn't causation. The climate was shifting violently at the end of the Ice Age, shrinking the island's landmass and altering the vegetation. So the extinction was likely a complex combination of environmental collapse and, yes, some human pressure.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've established how these early people arrived and this bizarre, incredible world they inhabited. But they didn't just survive and fade away.
Yeah.
Now we need to trace what happened over the next several millennia.
Right, because these early communities absolutely thrived. They evolved into the ancestors of the Chumash people.
And the Chumash sophistication is just mind-blowing. They were renowned for their maritime fishing, coastal trade, complex social organization. But the canoes, the tomol canoes, we have to talk about how they built those.
The tomol is a masterpiece of marine engineering. It's a highly advanced plank canoe.
Right, not just a hollowed-out log.
Yeah.
But how do you build a plank canoe without metal tools or nails?
Well, large timber was pretty scarce on the islands, so they harvested massive redwood trunks that drifted down the ocean currents all the way from Northern California.
Talk about utilizing your environment.
Exactly. Then they used bone and antler wedges to painstakingly split that driftwood into perfectly shaped planks. To bind them together, they drilled small holes and lashed the planks tightly with incredibly strong cordage made from milkweed or animal sinew.
But wait, if you're just lashing flat pieces of wood together, there are going to be gaps. How on earth do you make that watertight for the open ocean?
That is the genius part. They utilized asphaltum, which is a natural tar that seeps up from the ocean floor and washes ashore in Southern California. They would boil the tar, mix it with pine pitch, and meticulously caulk every single seam of the canoe.
That is incredible. And these things were big, right?
Very big. A tommel could be up to 30 feet long, capable of carrying heavy cargo and multiple crew members across those treacherous open ocean channels.
Which allowed them to build this massive economy. They had vast coastal trade networks. They manufactured shell bead currency from Olivella seashells that traded far inland. It's an unbroken chain of cultural evolution stretching 13,000 years.
Yes. An incredibly successful, continuous society. Until a massive turning point in the timeline.
The year 1542.
1542. That marks the arrival of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. He was a Portuguese explorer sailing for Spain and the first known European to navigate the California coast.
And the fallout from that contact.
Yeah.
It's just profoundly tragic.
It really is. As with almost everywhere else in the Americas, European contact triggered a catastrophic unraveling of indigenous societies. The biological impact alone was devastating.
Right, the introduction of foreign diseases.
Yes, diseases to which the indigenous populations had absolutely no immunity. It caused severe mortality rates, and over the ensuing centuries, this was compounded by colonization and the Spanish mission system.
And the mission system actively relocated people, didn't it?
Yes, they forcefully relocated the coastal and island populations to the mainland for agricultural, labor, and religious conversion. The social fabric of the islands was just torn apart. They were gradually attended.
Which brings us to one of the most haunting historical accounts in our sources, the lone woman of San Nicolas Island.
Such a powerful and heartbreaking story. Most people know her as the inspiration for the classic novel Island of the Blue Dolphins.
Right, so what actually happened to her?
In the 1830s, the final remaining indigenous inhabitants of San Nicolas Island were loaded onto a ship to be removed to the mainland. But during the chaos of the departure, one woman was left behind.
And she survived there alone for, what, 18 years?
Roughly 18 years, completely alone on a remote, windswept island. But she didn't just scrape by. She survived by utilizing the deep ancestral knowledge of the people who had lived there for 10,000 years.
The sources say she built shelters out of whale bones, she wove dresses from cormorant feathers, she hunted seals. I mean, it's a staggering testament to human resilience.
It truly is. But when she was finally rescued and brought to the mainland in 1853, the tragedy deepened. She couldn't communicate with anyone.
Oh, because her language was gone.
Exactly. The specific dialect of her language had effectively died out on the mainland during those 18 years, and sadly, she passed away just weeks after contact, primarily from contracting dysentery.
Wow. It's staggering to think about a continuous, sophisticated culture surviving for 13,000 years on these islands. Does the tragic story of the lone woman ultimately represent the final severing of that ancient, unbroken link to the island's first mariners?
In many ways, yes. Her life is a profound testament to those ancient maritime skills, but her death symbolizes that tragic severing of continuous indigenous occupation on the islands.
It is a really heavy history to process. You look at this incredible art, 13,000 years of adaptation, engineering, and survival, ending in such profound quiet on those islands today.
Yeah, the silence is definitely heavy.
Which brings us back to the present day and the current state of the debate. So, the whole Clovis first wall has basically completely fallen at this point, right? Most experts now agree humans arrived by sea, before or during the Clovis era.
The consensus has definitely shifted toward coastal migration, yes. However, the debate isn't fully settled by any means. There are still so many questions.
Like what? What are archaeologists still fighting over?
Well, we know they were there 13,000 years ago, but we don't know exactly when the first boats arrived. Was it 15,000 years ago? 20,000. And what was the ratio of people? Did half the population eventually walk through that inland ice corridor later while the other half sailed the Kelp Highway?
Right, because our sources are careful to point out that finding evidence of coastal migration on the Channel Islands doesn't automatically mean every single early American arrived by boat.
Exactly. It could very well be a mix of both migration routes. That is the thrilling frustration of archaeology right now. We're trying to understand a massive continent-wide migration using only the tiny fragments that managed to survive 13,000 years of geological change.
Because the ultimate undeniable proof, the ancient campsites, the remnants of those earliest boats, the tools left by the very first wave of mariners, they aren't on dry land.
No, they almost certainly are not. They are locked away in those submerged coastal plains beneath the Pacific Ocean.
So the future of this mystery, the future of understanding our deep past, it relies on submarines, deep-sea sonar, and underwater excavation. The frontier of archaeology isn't just digging down anymore, it's diving deep.
Absolutely. The next big breakthrough is probably sitting under 300 feet of salt water.
It really makes you rethink everything. Next time you stand on a beach looking out at the ocean, take a moment to realize you aren't just looking at water. You might be staring at the submerged homes, trails, and lost stories of the very first Americans, resting hundreds of feet below the waves, just waiting for us to find them.
Okay, one question for you. If future underwater excavations uncover even older human settlements beneath the California Channel Islands, do you think it will finally prove that the first Americans arrived by sea instead of traveling through the inland ice-free corridor? Why? Thanks.